If you've ever driven through the Ozark Mountains, you probably understand why so many people fall in love with the region. The forests seem endless, stretching across the hills in every direction. Small towns appear unexpectedly between valleys, their gas stations and diners looking almost frozen in time. During the day, the Ozarks can feel peaceful, even welcoming. But people who have lived there long enough will tell you that there are places hidden among those mountains that don't feel welcoming at all. Places where the forest grows unusually dense. Places where trails disappear from maps. Places that locals avoid discussing, especially after dark. Most visitors never hear about them because the stories rarely leave the communities where they originate. They stay confined to family conversations, hunting camps, and late-night discussions between people who trust each other enough to share what they've seen. One of those places is known as Hollow Creek, and according to the people who live near it, there is a very good reason nobody talks about it. I first heard the name in the summer of 2018 while traveling through northern Arkansas. At the time, I worked as a photographer who specialized in documenting abandoned locations. Old mining settlements, forgotten churches, deserted schools, collapsed factories. If a place had been left behind by history, I wanted to photograph it before nature erased the last traces. My work had taken me all over the country, and over the years I had developed a healthy skepticism toward local legends. Nearly every abandoned location came with rumors attached to it. Some were supposedly haunted. Others were said to contain hidden treasure. A few were associated with disappearances that became more mysterious every time the story was retold. Most of the time, the truth was much less dramatic. That's why I didn't take the story seriously when I first heard it. The conversation happened inside a small roadside diner outside Mountain View. The afternoon heat was intense, and I had stopped for lunch while planning the next few days of my trip. The diner was nearly empty. A couple of truck drivers sat near the entrance drinking coffee, and an elderly woman behind the counter was wiping down tables. I was studying satellite maps on my laptop when an older man approached and asked if he could sit down. He introduced himself as Walter. At first, the conversation was ordinary. He asked where I was from, what kind of photography I did, and whether I was enjoying the area. Then he noticed the maps on my screen and asked what I was searching for. When I explained that I documented abandoned places, something changed in his expression. He became quiet for a moment, as though debating whether to say something. Finally, he leaned forward and asked a question that immediately caught my attention. "Have you ever heard of Hollow Creek?" I told him I hadn't. The name meant nothing to me. Walter nodded slowly, almost as if he expected that answer. He looked toward the diner windows before continuing. "Most people haven't. That's the way folks around here prefer it." Naturally, that response made me curious. I asked him what Hollow Creek was. He hesitated before answering. According to Walter, Hollow Creek had once been a small settlement hidden deep within the mountains. It wasn't large enough to appear in most history books, but for decades it had been home to several dozen families who made their living through logging, hunting, and farming. The community existed throughout the early 20th century, isolated from the outside world by steep ridges and dense forests. Then, sometime during the 1960s, the settlement was abandoned. Official records blamed economic decline. Families moved away. Businesses closed. Eventually, nobody remained. At least, that was the official explanation. Walter didn't believe it. Neither did many of the older residents who still lived nearby. "What do they think happened?" I asked. For several seconds, he simply stared at the table. Then he said something that immediately changed the tone of the conversation. "They think something moved into the valley." I expected him to smile afterward, but he didn't. There was no humor in his voice. No indication that he was joking. When I asked what he meant, he shook his head. "Depends on who you ask. Some people called it a spirit. Some called it a curse. Others thought it was something much older." The story was beginning to sound like every other local legend I had encountered. Yet there was something unusual about the way Walter told it. Most people enjoy sharing ghost stories. They become animated, dramatic, even excited. Walter seemed uncomfortable. It felt less like he was telling a legend and more like he was discussing something he genuinely wished had never happened. He explained that strange reports began decades before the town was abandoned. Residents claimed they heard voices coming from the surrounding woods. At first, the sounds were dismissed as imagination. The valley was isolated, and strange echoes were common in mountainous terrain. But over time, the stories became harder to ignore. Hunters reported hearing conversations in areas where no other people were present. Farmers claimed someone called their names from the tree line while they worked in their fields. Children told their parents about voices whispering outside their bedroom windows late at night. The unsettling part wasn't merely that people heard voices. According to the stories, the voices always sounded familiar. They resembled friends, family members, or loved ones. As Walter described these events, I noticed that he avoided eye contact whenever he mentioned the voices. Eventually, I asked the obvious question. Did anyone ever find out where the sounds were coming from? Walter laughed quietly. Not because the question was funny. Because, apparently, many people had asked it before. That's the problem, he said. Some people went looking. And they never found anything. The diner suddenly felt much quieter than before. Even the country music playing through the speakers seemed distant. I found myself paying closer attention than I intended. Walter continued. The stories became more disturbing during the final years of Hollow Creek's existence. Residents began reporting disappearances. Most were temporary. Someone would leave home and become lost in the forest for several hours before returning confused and disoriented. Nearly all of them described hearing voices shortly before they vanished. A few claimed they followed the sounds deeper into the woods without realizing what they were doing. Others couldn't remember entire portions of time. One man supposedly disappeared for nearly 3 days and returned unable to explain where he had been. According to his family, he spent weeks afterward refusing to discuss the experience. I asked whether any official investigation had taken place. Walter nodded. From what I heard, a few deputies came out there over the years. Nothing ever came of it. What about the disappearances? Most people came back. The way he emphasized the word most immediately caught my attention. I stared at him. What happened to the others? For the first time since the conversation began, Walter looked genuinely uneasy. He lowered his voice. Not everyone returned. A chill moved through me despite the summer heat. The old man explained that local rumors spoke of several individuals who vanished permanently. Records from that era were incomplete, and many stories had become distorted with time, making it impossible to separate fact from exaggeration. Yet one detail remained consistent across every version. Before each disappearance, witnesses reported hearing voices. Always voices. Always coming from the forest. Always sounding familiar. By this point, I was fully invested in the story. Even if none of it was true, Hollow Creek sounded like exactly the type of forgotten place I enjoyed documenting. The combination of local folklore and historical mystery made it irresistible. I asked Walter whether any remains of the settlement still existed. He hesitated. Then he nodded. Supposedly. Supposedly. His expression darkened. People have trouble finding it. That answer made no sense. Abandoned settlements don't simply disappear. Even after decades of neglect, foundations, roads, and structures usually remain visible. Yet Walter insisted that locating Hollow Creek was strangely difficult. Hikers who searched for it often became lost. GPS devices malfunctioned. Trails seemed to vanish unexpectedly. Some people claimed they reached the valley only to find no evidence that a town had ever existed there. Others insisted they discovered foundations, wells, and ruined buildings hidden among the trees. The descriptions were wildly inconsistent. I asked if he had ever visited the place himself. For several moments he said nothing. Then he quietly answered. Once. The single word carried more weight than anything else he had said. I leaned forward. What happened? Walter's eyes drifted toward the diner window. Outside, a truck rolled slowly along the highway. For a moment, he appeared lost in memory. Finally, he spoke. I was 16 years old. His voice had become noticeably softer. He explained that he and 3 friends had decided to find Hollow Creek after hearing stories from older residents. Like most teenagers, they believed the legends were nonsense. Armed with little more than confidence and curiosity, they hiked into the mountains one Saturday morning determined to prove the rumors wrong. According to local directions, the valley should have been easy to locate. Instead, they spent most of the day wandering through dense forest without finding any sign of the settlement. Then the voices began. At first they sounded distant. Faint. Almost impossible to hear. The boys assumed other hikers were nearby. But as the hours passed, the sounds grew clearer. Walter claimed he heard someone call his name. One of his friends heard his mother. Another heard his older brother. The 4th boy heard nothing at all. What happened next would stay with Walter for the rest of his life. Because when they finally realized the voices were following them, they were already deep inside a part of the forest none of them recognized. And as the sun began to set behind the mountains, they saw something between the trees that should not have been there. A row of houses. Silent. Abandoned. Waiting. The houses appeared so suddenly that none of the boys noticed them at first. Walter told me they had spent the entire afternoon moving through dense forest, climbing over fallen logs, and pushing through thick undergrowth. The trees were packed so tightly together that visibility rarely extended more than 30 or 40 feet in any direction. One moment they were surrounded by wilderness, and the next they stepped into a clearing where an entire row of abandoned homes stood silently among the shadows. At first, they thought they had finally found Hollow Creek. The settlement looked old. Very old. The buildings were weathered by decades of exposure. Wooden porches sagged toward the ground. Roofs had partially collapsed. Vines crawled across exterior walls. Several windows were broken, while others remained strangely intact despite years of neglect. Yet something immediately felt wrong. Walter couldn't explain it then, and decades later he still struggled to find the right words. The town didn't look abandoned naturally. It looked abandoned suddenly, as though life had stopped there in the middle of an ordinary day. The boys cautiously approached the nearest house. The front door stood partially open. Leaves had accumulated across the porch. Inside, dust covered nearly every surface. A wooden table remained positioned near a window. Several chairs surrounded it. An old lantern sat untouched in the center. The strange part wasn't what they found. It was what they didn't find. There were no signs of decay inside the home. No animal nests. No evidence of scavengers. No extensive water damage. It was as though the building had somehow been protected from the passage of time. Walter remembered feeling increasingly uncomfortable as they explored. The silence was unlike anything he had experienced before. Forests are rarely quiet. Even deep wilderness contains sounds. Birds, insects, wind, the movement of animals through vegetation. Yet according to Walter, Hollow Creek seemed completely devoid of life. No birds sang. No insects buzzed. Even the trees appeared unnaturally still. The entire valley felt frozen. One of the boys suggested they leave immediately. Another insisted they continue exploring. Curiosity won. They moved deeper into the settlement. As they did, they began noticing peculiar details. Several houses appeared occupied despite being abandoned. Not occupied by people. Occupied by evidence. A pair of boots sat beside one doorway. A coffee cup rested on a kitchen counter. A newspaper lay folded on a table. Each object looked decades old. Yet none appeared disturbed. Nothing had been stolen. Nothing had been moved. The valley felt less like a ghost town and more like a place where everyone had simply vanished. Then they found the church. According to Walter, the structure stood near the center of the settlement. It was larger than the surrounding buildings and remarkably well preserved. A narrow steeple rose above the trees. The front doors remained closed. One of the boys pushed them open. The sound echoed throughout the valley. Inside, rows of wooden pews faced a small stage. Dust coated every surface. Sunlight filtered through stained glass windows, casting colored patterns across the floor. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. Then Walter noticed writing carved into the pews. Dozens of messages. Names. Dates. Single sentences repeated again and again. Most had become difficult to read with age. But one phrase remained clear. Don't answer them. Walter remembered staring at the words while a cold sensation spread through his chest. One of his friends laughed nervously. Another suggested it was probably part of some local prank. Before anyone could say more, they heard a voice. It came from outside. Clear. Close. Calling one of the boys by name. Everyone froze. The voice belonged to his father. At least, it sounded exactly like his father. The boy immediately turned toward the church entrance. His expression changed. Walter said he looked almost hypnotized, as though hearing something nobody else could understand. The voice called again. Closer this time. The boy started walking. Walter grabbed his arm. What are you doing? The boy didn't answer. His eyes remained fixed on the doorway. The voice called once more. Then another voice appeared. And another. Suddenly, each of the boys could hear someone speaking. A parent. A sibling. A friend. Every voice sounded familiar. Every voice seemed to come from somewhere outside the church. Panic spread quickly. The boys ran. They sprinted through the settlement without looking back. Branches whipped across their faces as they crashed through the forest. The voices followed, sometimes ahead of them, sometimes behind, sometimes from the trees themselves. Walter described the experience as a nightmare from which he couldn't wake. No matter which direction they ran, the sounds remained nearby. Hours later, after darkness had fallen completely, they finally reached a gravel road. The voices stopped immediately. The silence that followed was almost as frightening. The boys never returned to Hollow Creek. At least, that was what Walter told me. The story should have ended there. A strange experience. A frightening memory. Another piece of local folklore. Except it didn't. Because years later, people began disappearing in the area surrounding the valley. Not many. Just enough to create rumors. Hunters. Campers. Hikers. Individuals who ventured into remote sections of forest and never returned. Search teams occasionally located abandoned vehicles near trailheads. Sometimes they found equipment. Backpacks. Camping supplies. Personal belongings. Yet the owners were gone. Most disappearances received little attention beyond local communities. The Ozarks cover a massive area. People become lost in wilderness every year. Authorities usually attributed the incidents to accidents. Exposure. Animal attacks. Navigation errors. Practical explanations. Reasonable explanations. But local residents noticed a pattern. Several missing individuals had reportedly asked about Hollow Creek shortly before vanishing. Some had been researching abandoned settlements. Others were amateur explorers. A few were photographers like me. That realization unsettled me more than I cared to admit. As Walter continued speaking, I found myself wondering whether he understood how unbelievable his story sounded. The answer became clear when he reached into his pocket and removed a folded photograph. He placed it on the table. I looked down. The image showed 4 teenage boys standing beside a dirt road. One of them was clearly Walter. The photograph appeared old but genuine. I studied the faces. "There were 4 of you?" Walter nodded. "At the start." Something about his answer immediately caught my attention. At the start. The old man stared into his coffee. For several seconds, he remained silent. Then he spoke. "The 4th boy disappeared 2 years later." The diner suddenly felt colder. I waited. Walter continued. "The missing boy's name was Daniel. According to Walter, Daniel became obsessed with Hollow Creek after their visit. He constantly talked about returning. He wanted answers. He believed the valley contained something significant, something nobody else understood. Over time, his fascination grew worse. Friends noticed changes in his behavior. He became withdrawn, distracted. Sometimes he claimed he could hear voices at night, voices calling him from the mountains. Most people assumed he was joking. Then one afternoon, he left home and never came back. His truck was discovered several days later near a remote logging road. Search teams spent weeks looking for him. Nothing was found. No body. No campsite. No evidence. Just an empty vehicle. And according to Walter, one disturbing detail. A notebook left on the passenger seat. The final pages contained the same sentence repeated over and over. "They're still talking. They're still talking. They're still talking." Walter finished his story and sat quietly. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. Outside, afternoon sunlight reflected from passing cars. Inside, the diner seemed strangely distant. Eventually, I looked down at the hand-drawn map he had placed on the table. The route wound through mountains and forest roads before ending in a location marked with a single word. "Hollow Creek. You really think it's still there?" I asked. Walter sighed. "I know it's still there." The certainty in his voice surprised me. "How?" His eyes met mine. "Because people still disappear." I should have left the conversation at that. A sensible person would have. The story was interesting. The photographs were intriguing. But there was no reason to investigate further. Unfortunately, curiosity has a way of overpowering common sense. For the next 3 days, I couldn't stop thinking about Hollow Creek. The more I researched, the stranger things became. Historical references to the settlement were inconsistent. Some maps included it. Others didn't. Certain county records mentioned residents living there during the 1940s and 1950s. Yet documentation abruptly stopped afterward. It was as though the community had slowly vanished from official history. Online searches produced very little information. Most references consisted of brief forum posts written by hikers and amateur historians. Several described difficulty locating the settlement. Others claimed they found ruins but refused to provide exact coordinates. One post stood out. The author described hearing voices while camping near an unnamed valley in the Ozarks. According to the post, the sounds resembled family members calling from the forest. The writer ended with a warning. If you hear someone you know calling your name out there, don't answer. The account was posted 7 years earlier. The user never posted again. At that point, I convinced myself I was investigating a historical mystery. Nothing more. I packed my camera equipment and left Mountain View early one morning. The drive took several hours. Paved roads gradually became gravel. Gravel became dirt. Cell service disappeared. The mountains seemed to close around me. By late afternoon, I reached the final location marked on Walter's map. A narrow logging road extended into dense forest. According to the directions, Hollow Creek lay several miles beyond. I parked my truck, gathered my gear, and began walking. The forest immediately felt different. Not threatening. Not supernatural. Just isolated. The deeper I traveled, the quieter everything became. The air felt heavy beneath the canopy. Sunlight struggled to penetrate the dense vegetation. Occasionally, I stopped to photograph unusual rock formations and abandoned remnants of old logging operations. For several hours, nothing happened. No voices. No strange discoveries. No evidence supporting Walter's story. Part of me felt relieved. Another part felt disappointed. As evening approached, I considered turning back. Then I noticed something strange. The forest floor ahead contained signs of an old path. Not a modern trail. Something older. Faint depressions in the earth. Overgrown, yet still visible. Curiosity pulled me forward. The path wound between trees before descending into a narrow valley. As I followed it, an uneasy feeling settled over me. The temperature seemed lower. The air felt still. I realized I hadn't heard birds for several minutes. Then I reached the ridge. The valley spread below me. And for the first time, I understood why Walter had never forgotten what happened there. Because hidden among the trees beneath the fading evening light were the unmistakable remains of a town. Hollow Creek was real. And as I stood there staring down into the valley, I became aware of a sound drifting upward from somewhere below. A voice. Faint. Almost impossible to hear. Calling my name.